Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to span the range of the 14th through the 30th verses of Luke's 4th chapter. This is, for all intents and purpose, the first event of the Messiah's public ministry. Now we read of his virgin birth and the promise thereof in the first chapter. Then we read of the fact thereof in the second chapter, and then he's praised at the temple by two elderly prophets, and he's first shown to shepherds. And then we read of an incident which is unique to Luke's account of him being a 12-year-old at the temple, leaving the authorities, the scholars there, dumbfounded at his wisdom, even at the tender age of 12. And then we read of his genealogy, which, unlike Matthew's order, works from Matthew approaches it from Abraham to David to the Zedekiah to him, but Luke works backwards. He begins with him and goes all the way down to Adam in the final verse. Then we read of his temptation. We also read of his baptism before the genealogy by John, and we also read of the temptation. This is mentioned in all of the synoptics, but only Luke's and Matthew's have the dialogue of the temptation. Then after this, we find ourselves here in the event is going to take place in Nazareth, which was where for the first 30 years of his life he had lived in obscure anonymity. No one expected that he was Elohim in the flesh, certainly, so they were in for a surprise and an awakening when he shows up where he came from. And he was at the River Jordan when he was baptized, and he was in the wilderness somewhere to the east of it, we can imagine, when he was tempted. But now he's returning to Galilee, which is his native town, and we read native region rather. And Yahshua returned in the power of the Spirit to Galilee, and news of him went out through all the surrounding country. So the same power which had prompted him, now immediately after being baptized, we read that he was visited by the Spirit in the form of a dove, and then we read him that he led him into the wilderness for a 40-day fast, and then to be tempted at his most vulnerable moment. So the Spirit does not always lead us to pleasant places, but if we abide in its power, then we can emerge as victors from it. So he returned with the same power he had come with. He had endured, he had valued the spiritual appetites and treasures more fully than the food in his stomach or the glory of all the world in the moment in time, we read of in the 5th verse of this chapter. And also not to tempt the Father. And he, teaching in their congregations, being praised by all. So he was a practicing Jew, and as such he would have visited the synagogues on sabbaticals days, and the custom according to which the synagogue service procedures went about was there were either visiting rabbis who would come and read a scroll of the scriptures and then expound upon it, give their interpretation or sermon of sorts thereon. And we find him in such a role at this point, his reputation having preceded him. He was beloved by all for this brief moment in time in his public ministry. But as we read, the opposition starts in his very own hometown, and it is slow to develop, but that's just something that's going to come up after the main or the first dialogue between them. And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and according to his practice, he went into the congregation on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. So he was a practicing Jew and a habitual rabbi who gave what he had to say to every village he came across at this moment in his ministry, and his reputation had preceded him. They had never heard anyone like him, nor would they ever again. But when that calling came to the voice for the town from whence he hailed, it would be rejected, not only rejected, but violently so. So the opposition begins in our neck of the woods, in our hometowns, in our families sometimes. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. And having unrolled the scroll, he found the place where it was written. This is going to be a citation of Isaiah 61, verses 1 and 2, which reads, "The Ruah of Yahweh is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring the good news to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim release of the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, to send away crushed ones with the release." Now, the real foundation of this, as we will read in the next verse, we're just going to read it before we add it, to proclaim the acceptable year of Yahweh. So this is rooted in the Levitical year as outlined in Leviticus 25, the sabbatical year, every seventh year, when debts were to be restored, slaves were to be set free, and all debts returned and equalized and henceforth squashed, and so they could start anew. So there was something remedial about the work he came to do, but he also came to preach the good news to the poor who were on the outcast and on the outskirts of society and civilization, and also, or at least the benefits of it, and the brokenhearted. These are the ones who are going to be receptive to his message, because to come to the cross requires a brokenness of heart. There's really no other way. You have to mourn for your sins and desire for them to be crucified, that you theoretically and by faith enter into a co-crucifixion of sorts. And so there is liberty even when we are in bondage to him. That's the paradox of being a Christian. And we will give sight to the blind. We ourselves are spiritually blind, but we will be given the light we need to lead others as lighthouses into the fold of heaven. And this is acceptable in the year, so the time is now, in other words. That is the implicit inference of what he's saying as we read of his interpretation of it, which is going to send the shockwaves throughout that synagogue. "And having rolled up the scroll, he gave it back to the attendant and sat down. And the eyes of all in the congregation were fixed upon him." So he was a compelling speaker, so much so that when he said anything, he hadn't said anything about it meaning him yet. He had a magnetic lure of his presence, and there was something about him that made people look at him and listen to him differently. They knew that he was a man to be taken seriously, but then he says this seemingly ridiculous claim, "And he began to say to them, 'Today this scripture has been filled in your hearing.'" So this would have been interpreted readily as a messianic prophecy, and so he was claiming nothing less than to be the promised expectation who was going to liberate the nation of Israel, and through them the whole world. And that was just something they were not prepared for, especially from someone they had known as the son of a carpenter. He was a regular citizen just like them, so who was he to come in to return? They had no idea of what he had underwent since he came back, but they have a blank slate, so as far as they know, who is he? "And all were bearing witness to him, and marveled at the pleasant words that had come out of his mouth. And they said, 'Is not this the son of Joseph?'" So even though there is an acclaim to his persuasive prowess as a rhetorician or a public speaker or a preacher, there was a question about him. They knew him. He was familiar with Joseph. That was his biological father. We don't know if he was alive at this time. There is only reference to him in his birth and his early years. Afterwards, Mary was with the son all the way up to the cross, and that is where John, the beloved apostle and disciple John, was appointed her substitute son in his place, and she his mother. John alone of the disciples endured all the way to the crucifixion. But and he said to them, "No doubt, but you shall say this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself. Whatever we have heard being done in Capernaum, do also here in your country.'" So his reputation, Capernaum would have been the site and center for geographical purposes for his Galilean ministry. Capernaum was, I think, a fishing port town of some sorts around the Sea of Galilee, and it would have been geographically strategic to keep as the site, the operational center of one's ministry. So apparently he did perform miracles in Capernaum, and he was anticipating them to demand, as an evidence of their faithlessness, a sign from him. And he said, "Truly I say to you, no prophet is accepted in his own country. But truly I say to you, many widows were in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the heavens was shut up. And when the heaven was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, and there was a great famine in all the land. And Elisha was sent to none of them, but to a Zarephath, a Naaman of Zidon, to a woman and a widow. And many lepers were in Israel in the time of Elisha the prophet, and none of them were cleansed except Naaman the Aramean." So he's declaring war on their Judaic exclusivism by saying that even though he was in their midst, even though he had been born among them and had grown among them, they would not reject him. His message would be more readily and warmly received by the Gentiles outside their midst, inasmuch as they had been on the receiving end of the graces of two of the great early spoken prophets. These are in distinction to the written prophets. So even though Elijah and Elisha, neither of them have any books or chapters or writings attributed to them in scriptures, they were the men of great miracles and bold proclamations who confronted royalty, and their ministry took them outside of the promised land, and there they performed works and wonders on behalf of the Gentiles, because the Elohim on whose behalf they had performed is impartial in the distribution of his love and in his grace. And so he was saying that, as it had been the case then, there was no shortage of people in need of their healing ministries in Israel at these moments and times in which they ministered. Yet the path that they were on took them to to giving those services to Gentile people. And so, as it had been some 900 years ago, it would be today. And and all those in the congregation, when they heard this, were filled with wrath. So this upset them, this offended them, this provoked their sense of Judaic exclusivism. They wanted all the blessings and benefits of salvation hoarded amongst themselves. They did not fulfill their Abrahamic calling to be a light to the Gentiles, to bring blessings to them, at least for their national history. And rising up, they drove him out of the city and brought him to the brow of the hill on which their city was built, in order to throw him down. So this was not an ordinary eruption of outrage or anger. These people were mad. These people meant business. They had driven him all the way to the edge of the cliff with the intent to walk him straight off of it, to walk him off that. But as we read that, even in pre-resurrected form, the obstacles of space and time are no obstacle to the Messiah. His time had simply not come yet, so providential destiny would enable him and allow him to escape, as we read in the closing verse, which forms the heart of our lesson today. "But he, passing through the midst of them, went away." So his time had not come yet, but right from the early beginning, there was an audience member and a collection of them who wanted to kill him, and their sentiment would eventually trickle all the way up to the seat and center of the Sanhedrin, which was the ruling Jewish ecclesiastical and judicial body. And that would ultimately send him on his blood-soaked path, which he had contemplated while meditating out and fasting in the woods. and that's when he was tempted at his most vulnerable moment. But we're just going to read the 31st and 32nd verse while we're at it. And he came down to Capernaum, a city in Galilee, and was teaching them on the Sabbath. So even though he had just recently escaped the clutches of death, he's moving on. His ministry demands that he move forward, and as such, he's going to the Sabbath as a practicing Jew, to the synagogue in Capernaum, which was a more populous and significant city in Galilee than was Nazareth, which was a central village and hometown. I think it still survives and hosts a village of some 2,000 people or thereabouts, though it was never a big location and never has been. And they were astonished at his teaching, for his word was with authority. So that was what was most compelling about his speaking, and why no one had heard anything like it in a while, because the rabbis, they quoted authority, but he spoke with authority, and that is something they had not heard for some time. So even though he was rejected by the people who had known him the longest, the people he grew up with, the people who knew him and couldn't look past him only as the son of Joseph the carpenter, his message was from blanker slates proved to be a more fertile field to yield the abundance of the crops that his message had to offer. So they were general reaction. They were astonished to hear what he spoke and to hear what he had to say, and that was because he spoke with authority. And then we read of an exorcism. There was one man in the congregation who was demon-possessed, and he expels him. And then he, once more, they're in astonishment in verse 36, and then in 37, he... his reputation had preceded him, so the same reputation. Remember when he went into Nazareth, it was he was loved by all at that brief moment in time in his early ministry. And then he also performs more exorcisms in another location from Simon's mother-in-law, that would be Peter, his most trusted disciple. And then we're just going to close with the 42nd through the 44th verse, and that'll give us our close of Luke's 4th chapter. And when day came, he went out and proceeded to a lonely place, but the crowds were seeking him, and came to him, and tried to keep him from leaving them. So he demanded rest and solitude and break for contemplation, just to get away from it all and be in closer communion and connection to his Father. In order to do that, he had to physically withdraw when the moments in ministry grew too passionate or grew too dramatic. So because he had just performed these exorcisms that gave him such acclaim, he had to get away from it all, and he withdrew. But the crowd was persistent and determined. They located him, and when they did, they wouldn't let him leave. So from being expelled to the point of the cliff by the sea in your own native town, you now have these other people more receptive to your message, having the opposite reaction, not wanting you to get out of their town, but making sure that you stay as long as you can. And he said to them, "To the other cities I have also to bring the good news, the kingdom of Elohim, because for this I have been sent." So his entire ministry and message was to spread the kingdom of Elohim, which is both future and present. It was alive and in his form and in his presence. And the attentive disciples, with the eyes honed by faith, can recognize the present reality of the kingdom in our midst. It is wherever we think on it or dwell on it or live it out or act it out or preach or proclaim it. And this was the reason that we who minister are sent, and it was the same reason that he who is our model minister was sent. And he was proclaiming in the congregations of Galilee. Galilee was the geographical region to the northernmost extremity of the Roman province or territory of Palestine. It was arranged with Galilee on the top, Samaria in the middle, Judea in the south. His ministry would mostly be performed in Galilee and in Judea, although in John's account we do read and intervention in Samaria. I did 2 on those recently. I divided them up accordingly. I forget which way, honestly. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you soon. Take care until then. Bye-bye.